Good
So
news.
yeah, obviously we're living in the wake of the COVID times, and at least in Britain, people are kind of already forgetting what it was like because we're basically back to normal, aren't we? There's nothing really in daily life that is a relic of it. You see the odd person wearing a mask, but now they're a bit like a pariah. You see them like 1 in 100 people maybe.
I just love seeing like the stickers and stuff that are still about. They're all peeled off halfway. You know, they like stand 3 meters
It's a
apart.
very good metaphor for the degradation that it's caused to our economy in that they're all kind of decaying and decrepit.
Yeah.
But yes, there's recently been a study, a systematic review of the impact of mask wearing, and obviously throughout the pandemic, many people, ourselves included, suggested that yeah, these don't really work. Why are you mandating them?
Well, the government and the scientists said they didn't work, so we believed them. And then they all of a sudden all changed their mind
At the
overnight.
same time, yeah,
And it was like, that doesn't sound like physics hasn't changed. Size of virus versus size of gap in cotton. But for some reason, your opinions have changed. Okay.
so this study focuses on the physiological effects, and yes, I'm not a doctor, by the way, but I do understand the statistics that they've used because it's a systematic review and a meta-analysis, that sort of thing. You can look at the statistics to see whether the proper conduct was carried out, and it was, in my opinion. I actually think it's a very, very good study. And it was done by a broad church of academics from various places in Europe, and so it's not necessarily the product of an individual's bias because generally speaking, the more people you have working on it, the better quality it will be, as a rule of thumb. Not always though. But yes, my interpretation of the medical thing is only translating the terms. I'm not going to be explaining any of it. I'm just going to be explaining it in its actual in-text form, so everyone can understand it. But first, it's of course worth mentioning that we have covered other things as well to do with the COVID times. And recently, Dan on his Brokenomics series talked about the economics of lockdown. So if you would like to know a bit more about that side of things and our perspective on that, definitely check that out. It's also worth mentioning as well that there have been other things in the news, which I'm just going to briefly mention. Here's an article that came out relatively recently from the Daily Mail titled "How COVID Restrictions Hit Grandparents the Hardest. The elderly who couldn't see their grandchildren during lockdowns were twice as likely to suffer depression," study shows. I mean, we could have told you that, maybe not 2 times, it's difficult to quantify anecdotally, but of course that's going to have an effect. And obviously there are lots of impacts to these sorts of decisions, and of course I don't think
Nobody
that the
thought about
lockdowns...
any of them.
Yeah, and no one here agrees with the lockdowns. So if you want to know a bit more about that, definitely check out the Brokenomics. And even back in July of 2021, The Telegraph rather bravely published this article: "Cloth face masks are comfort blankets that do little to curb COVID spread," scientists warns. And of course this was in the midst of it all when people were still frothing at the mouth for it. And I just wanted to read, this was kind of the fringe opinion at the time, and even this is perhaps too charitable. And I'm just going to read a little bit about this because this was kind of the go-to skeptic argument, but with this new research paper, it's a lot worse than we thought, the actual effects of the face mask. So says Dr. Colin Axon, who has advised the government on minimising the risk of cross-infection in supermarkets, accused medics of presenting a cartoonish view of how tiny particles travel through the air. This is what you were alluding to earlier, I think. "Small sizes are not easily understood, but an imperfect analogy would be to imagine marbles fired at builders' scaffolding. Some might hit a pole and rebound, but obviously most will fly through. Medics have a cartoonised view of how particles move through the air. It's not their fault, it's not their domain. They've got a cartoonish view of how the world is," which I thought was quite funny. "Once a particle is not on a biological surface, it is no longer a biomedical issue, it is simply about physics. The public has only a partial view of the story if information only comes from one type of source. Medics have some of the answers, but not a whole view." And he goes on to say that yes, a COVID particle is around 100 nanometers. The material gaps in blue surgical masks are 1,000 times that size, and cloth mask gaps can be 5,000 times the size. So he's basically alluding to the fact that, yeah, well, wearing these things, it's not going to work, is it? I mean, the maths is there for you. Pretty plain.
But like the maths was done in what, like the 20s?
Yes, we've known this for a very long time.
Everyone knew this forever. In 2019, if you'd asked anyone, that's why there's so many clips of Fauci saying, well, yeah, that wouldn't work. But yeah, in 2020, you just went, yeah, it would work. Why? Why have your mind changed? The physics is the same.
Exactly. It's very unusual, isn't it? And obviously it's a political motivation rather than an evidence-based health one.
There were weird copiums about this at the time. Like, Johnny Harris made a video trying to argue the state's perspective, which is like, well, the big particles will be stopped by the face mask, so then there's a lower dosage that might hit you. It was like, but those are big particles. They wouldn't even get that far. Like, if you actually map this, like, because they're big, therefore heavy, they just fall to the ground in front of you anyway, like a meter or something. In which case, we're not really worried about them. Like, the whole point of the mask was to try and stop the small ones, but it's not small enough to do that.
Yeah.
So, waste of time.
Yes, exactly. But on to the actual study itself, which was published recently, and it's titled Physio-Metabolic and Clinical Consequences of Wearing Face Masks, Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis and Comprehensive Evaluation. And what I've done is I've cut out the important bits and I'm going to just explain them with the words used in the article. I'm not actually interpreting any of it, but I will be translating any terminology that is not entirely clear. Although the statistical stuff I know inside out, probably better than many academics actually, because I did a master's in it. But I'm going to start with the intro, and it talks about the actual rationale for doing the study in the first place. It says, in most countries, the use of medical face masks have been restricted to professionals for decades. In healthcare settings, masks constituted a mandatory self-protective and third-party protective measure for medical personnel prior to COVID-19, based on the assumption of efficacy of masks in reducing transmission of pathogens, especially bacteria. And of course, COVID was a virus. The effectiveness of masks in all healthcare settings was debatable even before 2020. In 2020, many scientists and leaders started to believe that the use of masks could also provide protection against viral transmission, although evidence for the effectiveness of this measure was only weak. Since the pandemic began, a large number of studies tried to assess the antiviral effects of masks with hardly conclusive results. And then they go on to provide a bit of a rationale for this study, and it says, as with any other preventative measure and or intervention, masks also have specific disadvantages. While certain properties may have justified their intervention and application in the past, for example, retention of bacteria during surgical wound care and operations, which I think everyone will concede is a very valid place to use it. At present, the question needs to be addressed as to the long-term effects widespread mask wearing may have on normal breathing. It is noteworthy that the compulsory wearing of masks for the entire population provided good research conditions for studying the adverse effects of mask wearing. And it says, recently the harmful effects of masks were highlighted in a large-scoping non-systematic review that has summoned for a systematic review with comprehensive evaluations of mask-induced adverse consequences, which is this study. And they go on to talk about the limitations of previous studies, which I think if you want to have a really good view is important, but I'm going to skip over that and just presume that yes, this is probably one of the best studies we've got yet. You don't have to take my word for it though, they go through and break down some of the previous literature, but it's just not that interesting to hear about. So it's also worth mentioning as well that the actual methodology of the systematic review is quite impenetrable to most people that don't have the research methodology background that I do. So I'm going to go out on a bit of a limit here and say that yes, I checked it, although I didn't run the numbers itself because that would take me days and days, weeks. But the actual methodology itself seems pretty solid by my reckoning. So take that with a pinch of salt, of course, that's just my opinion, but I don't think it's that controversial. It has been published in a prominent journal, which does check all of this stuff in more detail than I can possibly spend the time to. So with all of that out of the way, let's actually look at the interesting part, which is the results. And I'm just going to go through and read the summary that they've given of each individual point, but it's a very long study. And it says, in a pooled analysis, blood oxygen saturation resulted significantly lowered during mask use. And this could be found just for general mask use because they broke down mask use depending on whether it was the cloth masks, the surgical ones, which were the blue ones that were the ones that I normally was forced to use. And then you have the, as I think it N95, the big
ones
ones.
That actually worked if you wanted to deal with something.
Yes. And
which really restricts your inflow.
It does, yes. So unsurprisingly, yes, your blood oxygen saturation was lowered through wearing a mask. So that means you have less oxygen in your blood available for, say, living.
I mean, I don't think it would kill you, obviously.
It doesn't kill you because we are still alive, yes.
That was the funny thing about at the time. I remember people mentioning, well, it's probably going to reduce the oxygen inflow. And then people saying, what, you're going to die? So don't worry about it. I'm like, well, I don't know. There might be some other negatives.
There's
it's not death,
there's a lot
obviously.
of things in between being in perfect health and death, aren't there? I mean, it's
not in the public conversation.
Yes, you're either perfectly healthy or dead. There's no in between. There's no sickness. It's been solved already. But it says this was also confirmed in the subgroup analysis of the N95 mask use, but not necessarily for surgical mask use. And I think the surgical mask use, this is my own subjective interpretation, is because it doesn't really cling to your face very much. And when I was forced to wear one, I liked it the most because it meant that my mouth would get the least hot. Because my beard hairs grow through like copper wire, it's also really scratchy and unpleasant. And having a bit of airflow was nice, but it also defeats the purpose of it.
Yeah, it made no sense. But you haven't used the N95s?
No, I never wore one, though.
So we used them on a flight to Germany because we just didn't want to get sick in general because, you're traveling and you're work through. And like it just becomes like a rainforest around your mouth, which is why when I see people who are like freaks who are still wearing masks, but not just any N95s all the time, I look at them and just think, like, that's not comfortable in the slightest. It's actually unbearable because, of course, the water from your nose just builds up until your face is kind of dripping inside that mask, which is really gross.
It does sound gross, and we'll be talking about that effect later because they do talk about it and how harmful that actually is for you as well. So it says, in a separate meta-analysis of pre-post studies, an equal significant drop in SpO2, which is the amount of blood oxygen you have, was found when using a mask, and especially in the subgroup of N95 masks. So those are particularly bad for not giving you blood oxygen, and yet with a high heterogeneity, which means the variation in the data. So it depends on your circumstances. There's a large amount of variability. It's not necessarily a very consistent effect. I've just said the same thing like 4 different ways. But I've taken a segment from the discussion to contextualize what the effect of this result actually is. And it says, studies have shown that oxidative stress under hypoxic conditions can inhibit cell-mediated immune response to fight viral infections, which may gradually lead to immune suppression. So that's the complete opposite of what you would want it to do, isn't it? This may set the stage for contracting any infection, including SARS-CoV-2, and making the consequences of that infection much more severe. In essence, masks may put wearers at an increased risk of infection and severity. This is their words, by the way.
Just
verbatim.
For clarity, they're talking about N95s only, and prolonged usage.
It's just I think, except the surgical masks, it reduced your blood oxygen levels, and therefore any of these additional masks actually increased your susceptibility, but not necessarily the surgical one, because it's so bad at being an actual mask that you didn't have as significant a difference in...
There's no effect because it does nothing.
Yes. So it carries on to say, in a pooled analysis, blood carbon dioxide content was found to be significantly elevated in mask use. And of course, you breathe out carbon dioxide. It's not good to have it in your system. You can have carbon dioxide poisoning, which, believe it or not, kills you. And this was found in general mask use. There was also confirmed for N95 mask use and also surgical mask use. And it goes on to list the effects of this, saying, systemic CO2 concentration exerts an important influence on the intra and extracellular pH. CO2 passes quickly through the cell membrane to form carbonic acid, which releases protons and in excess causes acidosis. With a prolonged CO2 burden, the body uses the bones as CO2 storage to regulate the blood pH. Bicarbonate and positive ions are exchanged for hydrogen plus. Accordingly, kidney and organ calcification were frequently seen in animal studies of low-level CO2 exposure. And of course, they've used animals there because exposing human beings to low levels of CO2 is, believe it or not, immoral. But there's no reason to think that it's any different. Our respiratory systems aren't wildly different. So yes, supposedly this increased concentration of CO2 may have led to increased calcification of kidneys and other organs as well, which is not good, obviously. Additionally, CO2 in relationship with chronic and/or intermittent long-term exposure might induce pathological states by favouring DNA alterations and inflammation. Even slightly elevated CO2 induces higher levels of pro-inflammatory interleukin 1b, or 1 theta, I think it is, a protein involved in regulating immune responses, which causes inflammation, vasoconstrictions and vascular damage. In addition, carbon dioxide is also known as a trigger of oxidative stress caused by reactive oxygen species, including oxidative damage to cellular DNA. So it increased CO2 exposure damages your DNA. And this was provable in both the surgical mask and the N95 one.
Great.
I know, it's pretty harrowing, but it...
Did they give you any percentages about how bad? Because...
Well, they give percentages in this next one, but it's given in the tables, but not in the body of text, and I didn't necessarily want to bog it down with all of the numbers, because people are more concerned about the meaning, aren't they, and the actual impact. So it says, on average, masks reduced respiration minute volume by 19% according to our meta-analysis, and by as much as 24% for N95 masks. The difference between surgical masks and N95 masks was about 10% respiratory minute volume, and that's, I believe, just the amount of air you're taking in, I think, if I remember rightly. But it's to do with your rate of respiration, and it's probably the explanation for why you've got this reduced blood oxidization and increased CO2 retention. And it says, interestingly, no statistical difference regarding respiratory rate was found in mask use in the pooled analysis. And this is significant as well, because it's suggesting that, well, you've got more carbon dioxide in your bloodstream and less oxygen, and you're not breathing anymore to compensate for this. So it's suggesting that, yes, that it's not just a matter of, you know,
because
you take
you're wearing
deeper
the
breaths.
mask, breathe more, no problem.
Mm-hmm.
No, you're breathing the same, so
yes.
Problem.
Yes, it is a problem. And it says, a significant elevation in systolic blood pressure was found for mask users. In studies elevating both mask types, surgical and N95, the N95 mask always yielded a higher systolic blood pressure than the surgical mask. However, this effect was not statistically significant. So that's the difference between the two masks. But in all of the studies, the N95 one was worse, which is a running theme throughout the whole set of results. So one can presume that it's more damaging, but it's not necessarily to a statistically significant degree, if that makes sense. But yes, obviously, elevating blood pressure is very bad, particularly if you have heart conditions, you're elderly, many different things that an elevation in blood pressure could be harmful for. And I'm sure you people at home are well aware of this. It's quite a common problem to have to regulate your blood pressure. And it's very significant as well, because, I mean, look at things like heart disease. Only a very small stressor can cause someone to have, say, a heart attack. And it could have been it. I mean, people could well have had their blood pressure raised to a point where it could have been fatal. I mean, it's impossible to know for certain, of course, but...
I doubt anyone jotting down the reason as to why this happened is not going to jot down the goddamn mask.
So, carries on to say, there was no statistically significant difference regarding the heart rate during mask use in the pooled analysis. And of course, I forgot to clarify that the pooled analysis is just all mask use in general. However, in the subgroup analysis containing surgical and N95 masks, only for the N95 mask condition, a weak significance for a slight increase in heart rate could be found. So yes, your heart rate stays the same. And again, if the heart rate was slightly elevated, this suggests a compensation for the differences in oxidization and CO2 present. And moving on to the actual skin covering, or the skin being covered by the mask itself, it says, skin covered by masks had a significantly higher temperature during the rest and activity stages in studies, and said this could be found for general mask use and for N95 mask use, but not for surgical mask use. And I think that that's just because they're rubbish as masks and they let in lots of air. And it says the dead space covered by masks had a significantly higher humidity in the pooled analysis. And I mean, that's what you were saying earlier, isn't it? That it makes lots of moisture build up and it gets hotter. And it says here, increased humidity and temperature can increase droplet and aerosol generation, which facilitate liquid penetration through the mask mesh. This is not only increases the chance of microorganisms, both fungal and bacterial, growth on and in the masks, causing increased risk of accumulation of fungus and bacteria pathogens, but also leading to rebreathing of viruses that may be trapped and enriched within the moisturized mask and meshwork. Therefore, these conditions within masks are favorable for pathogenic growth and are unfavorable for good systemic microbiota, i.e. individual specific. So that's basically saying, yes, it's going to generate more bad stuff in there.
I mean, it's not really a surprise.
No, it's not, is it?
Like, what if I stick a bowl on my face so that I'm getting loads of water sticking around my mouth to the point that it's disgusting? Do you reckon this might be bad? Do you reckon there might be?
I don't know. I feel like you need to run that experiment. I'd like to see it.
Because that's what it feels like. I can't believe it didn't wear one at any point. It's just literally like you end up wearing it for like an hour flight or 2 hour flight or whatever. You take it off and it is dripping your entire face.
It's so disgusting, isn't it?
But that's like a 2 hour flight. And then you see people in real life who are wearing that constantly. Or people who are going on planes
people in
over
hospitals
8 hours.
And stuff that work like a 12-hour shift and they don't take their mask off.
Yeah, but the risk is worth it because you're in a high infection environment, right? But like you see the normal, well, so-called normal people wearing it in everyday parts of life, and you look at them and you just think, there is no risk reward there. You're just an insane person.
Yeah.
I don't know how you are okay with the amount of sweat that's dangling around your
Well, people are
face
really
right now.
bad at calculating risk at all, and when you combine that with fear, it makes people very irrational and move towards things that if they were clear-headed, they might not do.
Who's that journal everyone hates that doxed lived to TikTok?
Oh, Taylor Lorenz.
Yeah, Taylor Lorenz always tweets about her wearing an N95 on planes and stuff still. And I can't explain enough how much her face must be dripping every time she goes on one.
Well, it's making her more ill, apparently. And it says, as a result, the isolation of people with masks for extended periods can attain conditions for a new and individual-specific strain formation and mutations of pathogens to which other people in the environment will be susceptible and or not immune. So by wearing masks, it actually aids viral mutation and allows the virus to become more infectious. On top of it, making you personally more susceptible to getting ill as well. And it says, perceived discomfort was significantly higher in mask use during rest and activity in the pooled analysis, true of all mask types. I mean, this shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone who wore a mask. If you didn't at all, I mean, I respect you. In the N95 mask use, the perceived itching was significantly elevated, which I think alludes to what you were saying. Perceived exertion is significantly higher in mask use during activity in the pooled analysis. There was funnel plot asymmetry, which means that some of the studies may have had sampling biases there. That's what that test is for. So you need to take that result with a bit of a pinch of salt. Perceived shortness of breath was significantly higher during mask use during activity in the pooled analysis, and perceived heat is significantly higher during mask use with physical activity in the pooled analysis. In the subgroup analysis containing surgical and N95 masks, the heat perception was increased in both mask types, but only for the surgical masks condition, a statistical significant increase in heat perception could be found. So, in side effects of mask usage, headache was the most frequent symptom in a population of 2,525 subjects, with a prevalence of about 62% of general mask use. Did you get headaches from wearing a mask? I didn't really notice, or I didn't attribute it to the mask at the very least.
Seems easy enough.
What do you mean?
Like, I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And it says, additionally, the prevalence of acne in 1,500, roughly, evaluated mask users was quite high at 38%, and skin irritation in a sample of about 3,000 had a similar prevalence of 36%, Shortness of breath was highly prevalent in a population of just over 2,000, with 33% up to 37% for N95. Itching was also present in 26% of a population of 5,000 subjects, with a sharp difference between the 51% of N95 and the 17% of surgical masks. And it's worth bearing in mind, now I've got through most of these results, that these studies were only looking at short-term consequences of wearing masks and alluding to some of the potential long-term effects. Supposedly, we haven't been looking at these sorts of effects for long enough to look at the long-term effects, but based on the short-term effects we've looked at here, it seems like there are going to be a significant number of long-term effects that are going to be quite debilitating, especially all coming at the same time. So it's going to be immunosuppressant, it's going to be generating more fungal, bacterial and viral infections in the mask itself.
And
it's
mutation.
Going to be, yeah, and creating mutations, affecting your breathing, potentially altering your DNA, as well as many other things. I mean, it's pretty...
That's the point about any
harrowing
protective piece of equipment. Like, it's meant to have positives and negatives.
Mm-hmm.
And what was amazing about this period of human history is all of a sudden any negative idea was just didn't exist.
Mm-hmm. And the thing is that people were more willing to entertain the idea when people were more reasonable on it. When people became zealots about it and saying, "Oh, there's no bad things," well, it made people think, well, that's not true of most walks of life. There are trade-offs in everything. And it pushed people to basically our position, which, I mean, I'm not going to complain about. Good for them if they stop wearing masks. It seems like they've avoided a whole host of health issues.
But like you say, I'm worried about those, freaky people who are still wearing N95s constantly and have been for the last, 2 years. And you're just saying...
It's really not good for them, no.
Exactly, right? But then I'm thinking, good lord, they're going to have some weird side effects that were just not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
On my point about the risk, though, it just reminds me, I happened to do a lot of research on gas masks a while back because I was just interested in them. And a lot of Russian gas masks are basically crap. And some of them will end up giving you asbestos poisoning and stuff.
That's worse than a lot of the things it protects you from, isn't it?
But the point being that, this gas mask might really negatively affect you, but you might also be about to die to gas. So
There's
risk-reward.
at least a reasonable trade-off there. Whereas...
Yeah, and this is like a principle with all protective equipment. Gas masks are just the most extreme example. And Russian gas masks are the most extreme of extreme. But... yeah, that calculation just no one thinks about, and that's how you get the weirdos who are still walking around like Taylor Lorenz.
I know, I don't understand it, because although I'm in my 20s, when I did get COVID, it was really quite mild. I mean, I stayed at home and played video games and actually kind of had a good time. I enjoyed having COVID. It was really mild. It felt less severe than a regular old cold, and I think the main effect of it was that it did affect my breathing a little bit about 5 days afterwards. And then
not to say that
better.
if you're 80, it could be much worse.
Well, yes, of course. Everything's worse if you're 80 health-wise, isn't it? If you're a young man who's healthy in your 20s, then of course it's not going to be too bad. I mean, there are lots of things that are not as bad then. It's also worth mentioning as well that towards the end of the study, they mention the fact that it is possible that some symptoms attributed to long COVID are predominantly mask-related. And it's interesting that they use the word predominantly. That's implying...
Oh, that's interesting.
It's implying that all of the long COVID stuff may have actually been made worse at the very least, if not entirely caused by the masks in the first place.
There's a few people I see who are endlessly talking about long COVID affected their lives, and I also happen to know that these people I follow are also big N95 mask users all the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's just pure speculation, but I'm just like, oh no.
I mean, that's something that I imagine is going to be researched even more, but I can certainly see it being the case, seeing all of these significant effects of mask usage. So I thought that this was really, really important to talk about, because this is something the entire world did, and it seems like the entire world is going to suffer the health consequences of this, myself included. I mean, I was forced to go along with it like everyone else, although I didn't wear it wherever possible. But even so, I don't doubt that many of these effects have happened to all of us, and it is something that we should be really annoyed about. And the only reason I'm not annoyed about it right now is because I spent all of yesterday despairing at the state of the world and how we've just carried out this horrific thing basically for nothing, to make things worse. And it's just very, very harrowing, isn't it?
If you appreciated that segment from the podcast The Lotus Eaters, you can go to lotuseaters.com to get access to all the premium content that's on the site. such as the Brokenomics series, this episode on BlackRock Incorporated. If you'd like to find out what else is being put out, you can follow on Getter at lotuseaters_com on Getter. Thank you and goodbye.